Hi, I wanted to share with you some thoughts that I had, some random thoughts, as I am preparing my next review. I kept thinking of some similarities, some perhaps potential difficulties, or rather quirks, things that tabletop role playing games, MMORPGs, and old school role playing games have in common. It seems like a disconnected menagerie of sorts. We have, on the one hand, tabletop games, then we have MMORPGs, and then we have old school role playing games. But I started to think that throughout the years, I have identified some things that they have in common. They tell a lot about ourselves, our current times, and about the games themselves. So, join me as I try to make sense of these disconnected thoughts. So, like I said, there are so many similar changes that happen and that are shared between tabletop role playing games, MMORPGs, and old school RPGs. And one thing that I noticed, for example, because I'm going to handle things as a sort of list, although I have these like notes that I made quite chaotic, I will try to make some connections between those notes. But I have noticed the lack of incentive or reason or profit when it comes to grouping with others or playing with others, even in tabletop role playing games. Maybe a lot of young people are watching this video and they think that this isn't so much of a change, but rather something that always was. But if you go back a few decades, you will see that, for example, solo and cooperative role playing games are a recent thing. And that I actually think that's a great thing. But at the same time, you can see some disconnection, or rather some tendencies to stop searching for the perfect group. Although there is no perfect role playing game group, now you have so many reasons to have smaller groups or just a single player with solo role playing game emulators, systems, etc. I think this is due to several reasons, but the most obvious to me is that there are so many different themes and varieties and genres and subgenres of role playing games nowadays. Before, in the 70s, 80s, we didn't have as many role playing games. So during the early days of the hobby, you had Dungeons and Dragons, Tunnels and Trolls. Later on, you had all of those White Wolf storytelling sort of games. But and that's the reason why back then it was a little more easy, a bit more easy to find people for those role playing games. You could argue that Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition in current times it's still quite popular, at least as popular as it can get within the RPG hobby, or some would say a bit more mainstream, and it's quite considerably easier to find a group for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition than other systems. But back then, as I told you, if you want to play, if you wanted to play Vampire the Masquerade back then, I think it's a lot more common when compared to today, because the community, the World of Darkness community, in my opinion, has been going through some division, because you have so many versions of Vampire the Masquerade, or editions. Unlike Dungeons and Dragons, like I told you, you have the most popular one, 5th edition, but I think Vampire the Masquerade 20th anniversary, it's still pretty much played because a lot of people love that specific setting. But I have seen, when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, that there are some editions that are the favorites of certain groups. For example, I think it's a lot more difficult to find a group for Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition. A lot of people did not like 4th edition because it felt too much like an MMORPG, like a video game or perhaps even a board game. So you can see those changes. And in current times, because there are so many solo role playing games, you have Scarlet Heroes Deluxe, Tunnels and Trolls, emulators, and there have been so many new solo RPGs and co-op RPGs. Sorry, I have several that I want to talk about, but I want to play them first so that I can give you my honest opinion. I would like to recommend them all, but I don't want to give you like some random names, and some of them could be pretty bad. In fact, I actually had high hopes for one, and when I noticed that the product was quite incomplete, that is, you do have a system and a structure, but everything else you need to create on your own. Unlike Scarlet Heroes, that gives you so many to work, so many materials, so many tags and items to work with. It's almost everything is just right there for you, for the taking, for you to start your campaign and start having adventures in a city or in the wilderness or in a dungeon. You have the enemies, the rooms, the plot lines, everything so easy to generate during play. And I've been playing a solo role playing game that, despite being quite unpolished, I think it's one of the greatest solo RPGs out there, but I want to play it a bit more before I come out with my final thoughts. So in that sense, like I told you, I think there are many reasons for people not to, if they want to play with like a physical group, not via the internet using those chat services and different apps and websites to play role-playing games online. If you want to have people at the table, there are so many role-playing games that work perfectly with small groups, unlike in older editions of different role-playing games that you were encouraged to have like 12 or 16 players at the table at the same time. And like I said, it was a lot easier to manage those, to have those huge groups, because there weren't too many role-playing game options available. Imagine the early days of Dungeons and Dragons, when Dungeons and Dragons was the only role-playing game out there. You only had to almost like make an offer, let's say, just call your players and tell them, I'm going to be running Dungeons and Dragons, and they're like, oh well, that's the only role-playing game that there is at that time. So it was quite easy for you to get all of those players at the same time. But now times have changed. I've seen several videos as well throughout the years here in YouTube where people try to say that it is related to our each player's individual lifestyles or ways of enjoying the hobby. But I don't think it's related to lives or just the experience of a single individual. I think it's a reflection of the current times that we are experiencing. It's not that, oh, that person doesn't have too much time, but because back then that person used to play when they were teenagers or kids. But nowadays you see kids and teenagers with lifestyles that are just so busy, so cluttered with so many activities, and a lot of them, I would say most of them, are not actually positive. Not only counting the flawed educational system, but also all of those hours spent in social media, in Twitter and Facebook and all of that. I think that's quite unhealthy. So, and I think that's somehow like a trend or a tendency. Some would even say like a disease of current times, because there are some uses for those particular media, but sometimes people get just too hooked. They live inside those I don't know if I should call them forms of entertainment, or rather like sources of potential information, even though sometimes they turn into disinformation. So I think it's not it doesn't have to do with you getting older and, oh, you can't play as much as you used to play because now you have a family and you have a job and all of that. I think it's mostly a reflection of current times. And this is where I made the connection with MMORPGs. A lot of people say that role-playing games were better back then, the golden age of MMORPGs. You may remember a few videos that I did concerning my MMORPG experience in the past. I will give some more details when it comes to the present times. by the end of this video. But when it comes to my past experience in MMORPGs, comparing it to current times, I was quite busy back then and quite busy in present times. But the thing that changed a lot is that back then it was so necessary, so vital, essential for you to team up with others. And you see so many MMORPGs where it's much better or preferable for many players to just solo the entire storyline, the entire progression, or the entire arc, not grouping with others, and they reach the end game, and then it's when they party up, or only during specific parts of the story. And when you compare that with EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI back then, you needed to make friends immediately, and some created really powerful bonds. So I think it's very much related that nowadays it is not encouraged for people to come together. There is so much division, so many manipulation on the parts of politics and religions and different social concepts and constructs, that it's very hard to communicate with people without triggering as if they have some sort of mental problems, saying something that they simply cannot tolerate or accept. The exchange of ideas has been corroded, contaminated, to the point that you could clash easily with different players because of gender identity and religion and politics. You always have to be on side A or side B or side C, or you need to pick like a team, and it shouldn't be like that. We are all human after all. That's the side that matters the most. You don't have to give priority to different political allegiances and different religious idols. You should be faithful to humanity itself. That's the way I see it. So it's so easy for me to see why people are so divided when it comes to tabletop role-playing games and MMORPGs. And when it comes to old school role-playing games, that is like Might and Magic, for example, Wizardry, you could be thinking, but those are not social experiences after all. How would people come together in those cases? And I don't think this is as negative as it appears when comparing it to tabletop role-playing games or MMORPGs in current times. I think it's rather like a quirk, like I told you, some characteristic, because when those really hard, very difficult, very cryptic old school role-playing games and dungeon crawlers came out back then, you were expected to talk with other players or read those gaming magazines where players would send their questions and tips and advice, and you were talking in different chat rooms, because we didn't have back then the huge libraries we have today in the internet, where you just go to game frequently asked questions or game facts, and you look up the game that you want to look for a walkthrough concerning that game or tips. Or Steam, you can also find many Steam guides telling you how to beat this or that place, that area of the dungeon, that puzzle, complete walkthroughs. So that also cuts the communication that used to exist when it comes to old school role-playing games, because a lot of you know, if you try to play Might and Magic or Wizardry without any help at all, without any guide, you need to create your paper map, you need to look and search every nook and cranny, something that could be quite vital to finish the game. It's just hidden in some place in the forest, in some square, and it's behind some sort of illusionary wall. And sometimes it's really annoying. If I remember correctly, I think it's Might and Magic 2. You need a group of the same class. If I remember correctly, it's kind of like you need a group of thieves, a group of knights. You need groups of a single class to participate in quests that are vital to finish the game. And that's why I found it quite annoying, because the first time that I bumped into that wall, I had my party of different classes, and you feel forced to to choose those to create parties of a single class, a party of thieves to take on this particular quest that is pretty much necessary to finish the game. And like I said, when you communicate with others, or back then, if you communicated with others, or nowadays, if you look up the walkthroughs or guides, or all of that, you can see that, oh, before we start, make sure that you rescue these party members in that location, because even though they are of the same class, they will help you when you create a group to finish the game. Or you should create several thieves and several wizards or whatever. So yes, that's quite clear when it comes to those old school role-playing games. Now, another thing that I think created these sort of changes throughout the years when it comes to tabletop RPGs, MMORPGs, and old school RPGs is that there are too many other similar or even different forms of entertainment. That is, back then, you only had a few tabletop role-playing games, or a few MMORPGs, or a few old school RPGs. If you're looking for a particular experience, you had to settle for what you had. But in current times, in present times, you have so many different tabletop role-playing games and MMORPGs and old school RPGs that sometimes things feel quite scattered. So when it comes to tabletop role-playing games, there are many people that pretty much end up buying a role-playing game because they like it, they love it, and then they have a very difficult time finding people to play that game with. And like I said, you can always look for a group online to play via video chat. But if you want to have people at your table that like that game, it's going to be a very difficult time. You could look for them online, but maybe a lot of them live in different cities or even different countries, so it's very difficult to come together to play those games. And when it comes to MMORPGs, so many MMORPGs out there in the market, and following different ways of fees or pricing. Some MMORPGs are free to play, some others have that monthly fee. So when you had just a few MMORPGs that were the most popular ones, like I said, EverQuest, Ultima Online, Final Fantasy XI, it was much easier for you to find people to create a group. I think the ones that are designing MMORPGs or handling MMORPGs nowadays are quite aware of this, and that's why they put all of that solo content. They know that there's going to be a lot of players that will not be able to create steady groups, or even let alone guilds, or whatever group you have, depending on the MMORPG. But they are also aware that there are players that are either friends or family in real life, or that they have been playing together in many other different MMORPGs, and they just make the jump to another MMORPG when it's more popular. So it's very difficult for someone who just starts playing an MMORPG and tries to find a group or a guild when those groups and guilds have already been formed or created. It's like a barrier, and those are the players that enjoy the solo content for a while, and then they just leave the game, perhaps because it's like playing another role-playing game as a solo experience. Not to mention that MMORPGs are quite time-consuming. Depending on how you play them, you may end up passing by or ignoring many other video games or even other hobbies because they take so much time. And this connects with old school role-playing games in the sense that even if a very enthusiastic and driven design group creates an old school role-playing game, or in that style, like a retro game, it is not certain that people will play that game, because there are so many old school RPGs out there, both the ones that existed decades ago and new ones that are created trying to emulate that old school style. Another thought that I had is that the expenses for creating all of these games, that is tabletop, MMORPG, etc., have gone up due to the competition. Crowdfunding helps, but and I've seen some very successful cases, like everything that Kevin Crawford brings out for in tabletop role playing games. Stars Without Number, Scarlet Heroes. I think that was also funded through Kickstarter, if I remember correctly. I think there's another role playing game that he's going to be producing, if I remember correctly. It was Worlds Without Number, I think. Godbound is also great. So he has been doing a great job with crowdfunding, and that's a great example on how you can still produce role playing games, obtaining a profit and not getting crushed by the competition. Of course, you also have to take into consideration that Kevin Crawford, I consider him one of the masters of old school Renaissance. So it's also about your passion for the hobby, your abilities to design the game, your style. But when it comes to MMORPGs, yes, it's quite expensive. You always see those MMORPGs just coming and going, being born and dying immediately. There is a channel, I'll see if I can find it, I don't remember the name, but he covers many cases in which MMORPGs have just died, have been cancelled, have been abandoned because they couldn't last against the competition. And when it comes to old school role playing games that are not multiplayer experiences, that's also the same thing. Like I told you, you spend so much time designing those games, coding and coming up with the assets or acquiring the assets, hiring people, managing the entire project. It could take years depending on the scope of your project. And when it finally comes out, nobody plays it or buys it, or only a few people enjoy that game. Throughout the years, again, I have seen some people, some designers that become a bit frustrated when they come up with a tabletop RPG or MMORPG or old school style role playing game, and they say something like, "Oh, I'm pretty sad because I know that only a few people will enjoy it," and then someone else like says, "Well, it's the thought that counts," or that player that managed to enjoy your game, you made that player very happy, but they would prefer if they would be able to get a lot of people into the project that they created. But there are so many games, and I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. Good for us because we have so many choices, but it's pretty somewhat sad for those designers because it's not a sure thing that many people will enjoy. Sometimes they're masterpieces, sometimes they create masterpieces, but because they are a game in a sea of so many games, and usually games that have good marketing and promotion are the ones that become more popular or that have some sort of backing from a very popular company. You see those games just coming and going. Let's see. Another thing that I have identified is that there is some sort of disconnection with reality or a non-positive fantasy when it comes to your expectations of a tabletop RPG, MMORPG, etc. When it comes to tabletop role-playing games, I think it's the other way around. I think, for example, when I first started to play role-playing games many years ago, well, not many, I'm not that old. I'm 38 years old. Uh, I just saw them at first as if they were perhaps kind of like a board game, but they are so much more. You really need to live the game when you are playing at that table. When you are making those rolls and describing what your character is doing, you really need to feel like you are actually there. If things are being handled by a good game master, you need to play as if you are actually there, looking at the ceiling, the walls, the floor of any room that you are exploring or that you are investigating. And when it comes to battle, you need to feel like you are actually fighting those enemies, and that's when you come up with some really creative and sometimes crazy ideas on how to use your spells and your swords, axes, shields. I was actually going to mention this at the beginning of this video, but today I saw a video that makes a good argument or a good case when it comes to bridging the design philosophies of tabletop role playing games with video game role playing games. Mm, I'm going to put the link in the description below. Mm, I think it's worth watching. Maybe some concepts will differ from what you think, but the guy does a pretty good job. So, like I said, where was I? The expectations of fantasy, of course. When it comes to MMORPGs, I think that a lot of people could end up disappointed when it comes to those experiences. Like I said, in the case of people that want to play with others, maybe they enter this MMORPG and they go up to level 10, level 20, level 30, and they rarely party up or group up with others because the entire game is designed to be a solo experience. And only during the end game, maybe they will manage to get a steady group going or get into a guild or depending on the game, mm, alliance or whatever they call them. Mm, but it's quite obvious, like I mentioned, you have those groups that have been already formed, perhaps before the game even started, perhaps family members and friends or groups of friends that come from other MMORPGs. Sometimes you see in different games those packages or combos or special subscriptions that says like, oh, the next expansion for this MMORPG is coming. We have the family package, buy who knows how many copies at a discount so you can invite your friends and family, and those are the people that are going to enter the game and are going to be creating those guilds and those link shells and any name depending on the role MMORPG. And many of those do not accept others that went into the role-playing game alone. So in that sense, I think that's a negative thing. Not to blame the people that come en masse to play the MMORPG, but there should be some other incentive. In vanilla Final Fantasy 11, if I'm not mistaken, when it first came out and you wanted to play, everybody appeared in different servers. It was almost impossible for you to appear in the same server that your friend or your brother or sister or anyone related to you would start playing in. This was made intentionally. If you study the history of Final Fantasy XI, the creation and design, the early design, you see that the people in charge actually wanted to make things so that people would be forced to create groups and alliances with people that they didn't even know. That's why they had that translation system to play with Japanese players and many other players. So I think that's, like I said, a negative aspect. But even though in those games you had the option to pay a fee to transfer to another server and play with your friends and family, you were somewhat encouraged to create groups, to form friendships with people, with strangers in different servers. And when it comes to old school role playing games that they do not have the multiplayer feature, I think when it comes to your expectation or the negative fantasy that you could come up with as you purchase the game is mostly reflected on the cover of the game. I remember all of those role-playing games when I first started to play different Nintendo and computer role-playing games. You see the cover and you see this knight fighting a dragon. It felt so action-packed. And when you started to actually play the game, it was like a turn-by-turn menu-based combat. So you had to adjust yourself that what you were expecting of the cover was a completely different thing. Even if you saw the knight or the adventurer or the wizard having this awesome fight, very organic, very lively against a dragon or some undead or monster or whatever, you actually needed to use a lot of your imagination when you played the game. That's why many retro, old school, pixel art style of games still have a market. Despite what I said of that, it is very difficult for you to produce sure success because there are so many games. There are still many people like me that play those old school retro style of video games or pixel art games where you don't even have a face for the character. You only have like this square representing the head and the face, and it's because it's like kind of like reading a book. You start to imagine things. You imagine the face, and the video game only supports the fantasy through the music, the gameplay itself, the simple graphics, but you are coloring the entire experience with your own imagination. Let's see what else I wrote here. I think that another uh, incentive or encouragement on the part of companies to get people to play different tabletop RPGs, different MMORPGs, and old school RPGs is that they simplify things a lot. Because there are so many games out there, and people, because of many different factors, a lot of people have short attention span, but others, and that's to give you a positive example, but others have different tastes, different, they like many different things, so they don't have to play the same thing all the time. They want to jump into something, into a role-playing game, an MMORPG, an old school RPG, understand how you play that game, perhaps take that character to the highest level possible if you liked that game, and then you move on to something else. But that could take considerably longer if the system is more complex. You need more time to learn that system. When it comes to MMORPGs, it's the same thing. If you play those old school style of games, for example, there are many old school games still running. I will mention something interesting related to that by the end of this video. There's one called Astonia, if I remember correctly. Astonia, Yendor's Revenge, or the Return of Yendor. I'm going to put a link if I find the correct name. But I played that one once. I actually didn't like it that much just because you couldn't modify the appearance of your character, because there are many ways to modify your appearance in simple details, but everybody almost looks the same. It's the same thing that I think made me eventually abandon the Record of Lawless War MMORPG. Everybody had the same character model, so or just a few character models, and I think that takes a lot of the originality, and I will cover more about that in a future video. So, but despite that, if you do not think that's a hindrance to your enjoyment or an obstacle, you can still enjoy those old school role-playing games, but they are so cryptic when it comes to their menus and the word and number combinations that you need to write to activate specific things, to open menus, to use different spells. Kind of like going to old school style RPGs, Might and Magic. When you remember when you cast a spell in Might and Magic in the first one, you have to type, it was C S. At the very least, it was C, and then you had to memorize or had the number of the spell written or in the manual on the side, and you were like, I'm going to cast Fireball, and you were like C 6, and then you chose the enemies. It was really clunky when nowadays you simply do things with the click of a mouse. That's so comfortable. But there is a certain charm to dominating all of those things when you master those difficult and clunky mechanics. I think that same thing applies to to tabletop role-playing games and board games even. All of those fiddly elements, sometimes you feel like a master of the game because suddenly you have memorized all of those things and you are typing along, or in the case of role-playing games, sorry, tabletop role-playing games, just making those rolls and writing things, and you have memorized so many things. So I think that's an acquired taste perhaps, but it's still a barrier of entry for many, that they want to enjoy so many things at the same time. many different games, and they don't have the time or perhaps the mental fortitude to learn so many systems at the same time, because those systems are complex. That's understandable, but if you enjoy those things, I think that's also a pleasant experience. It's kind of like exercise for your brain, like a massage of sorts. I've mentioned this in several videos, kind of like a brain massage when you handle those difficult things somewhat easily. Mm. And I also think that they make things easier when it comes to accomplishing things in tabletop role playing games, in MMORPGs, and in some newer old school style role playing games. Could argue that they are not true retro games or true old school games if they make things somewhat easier. But because if it's easy for you to triumph in different situations, in battle, in combat, you get that dopamine rush. You're like, oh, I won that battle in that game, whatever game it is. You feel like so motivated, or you have this somewhat false sense of accomplishment because they were hand holding you all the time, and the combat was just so simplified, and it was so easy for you to figure out the stats and how to build your character that some could consider it a false sense of pride. But like I said, maybe you're not looking to become a master of a game. Maybe you just want to enjoy the experience and you want to handle things in a simplified way. But it's still an interesting thing to consider if you are actually, if that sense of accomplishment is actually because you succeeded at something that was difficult, or if it was just so easy that anybody could do it. And that applies to some supposedly old school or retro style of role playing games in present times, like an old school renaissance of sorts, but they still simplify and make things easier for the player. A few days back, I'm always watching different videos related to games, and it was in a I think it was in a EverQuest video where they mentioned how you can get killed in EverQuest and you suffer an experience penalty, and you could even lose your gear. And he was like, oh, that's horrible design, that's the worst game ever. But some actually consider it a positive thing because you get that. There's also excitement in not getting killed, in understanding that it's so easy for you to die in that game, as if you were to take on a very dangerous situation in real life. Sometimes there is no room for error. So those MMORPGs that handle things like that, or even old school RPGs sort of in the rogue style, and some tabletop role-playing games that you died and there is no way to bring you back from the dead, there is an excitement for that. I think that could be abused. I think there are some styles that justify protecting or cuddling players like that, but there are some ridiculous things about role-playing games, in my opinion, where they tell you, oh, if the game master must ask for your permission before he kills your character. How ridiculous it would be if in real life, if you were about to die and suddenly a Grim Reaper appeared, or God or whatever, and told you, do you want to die right now? And you were like, no, oh, okay, you won't die. So it takes so much from that excitement of cheating or defeating death when it comes to take you in those games. So I think in my case, I think that's a negative thing, in my personal opinion. But all of this explains, pretty much tells you how much you love a particular hobby or a particular game, because despite of all of those things, you can always find a tabletop role-playing game, an MMORPG, or any old school RPG that is one of those that came out decades ago, or that have been designed recently with some old school or retro sensibilities, and you can still enjoy that game despite the many changes that the hobbies have experienced or have gone through in going from past to present and towards the future. Now I'm going to share you something very interesting. Share with you something very interesting. A few days ago, I decided to get into EverQuest because I never really played EverQuest. I only played the PlayStation 2 version, the Champions of Norath, and the sequel. I don't remember the name. So I always wanted to try out EverQuest, but I always hesitated a bit because they said, well, now that it's free to play, um, everybody's playing the progression servers where they simulate that experience of when the game first came out, and everybody has this party of nobody ever parties during the earlier levels, and only very few people, very specific people, party up when you are in level 50 and 60 and 70. So you heard all of those rumors. mm, so I thought, oh no, I'm going to create a character and it's going to be a horrible experience. Why do I even want to play EverQuest if I'm not going to group up and experience those moments of danger and that you feel worried for your character, that that character is going to die or you're going to lose experience points. But I am quite surprised. I immediately started to play and I immediately got into groups. I needed to. I was just moving through this series of spider web covered tunnels. It's in the box server, and I saw this huge spider, and there was this player, and he was moving quite close to the spider, and I was like, "Look out! There's a spider queen above you!" And he was like, "Yes, that thing has killed me twice already." And he was like, "Do you want to?" No, I told him, "Well, do you want to defeat it? Do you want to team up to defeat it?" And he was like, "Yes." And we got into a group and we took it on together. We killed the spider. It was really exciting because I had also been defeated once by that spider. So using teamwork, I play as a berserker, and he was a bard, if I'm not mistaken. We totally defeated that spider quite well, and we were like congratulating each other that, oh, he was like, oh, great berserker, you clipped that spider's head in two with your axe. And I was like, oh, I wouldn't have done it without your song or your bardic melody and ah ha ha and all that. And next, in another occasion, because we have different schedules, of course, I was moving through that same area, but I finally managed to get the quest to defeat that spider queen. And I was looking for someone to help me, and I thought maybe I can take it. I can defeat the spider alone with my current gear, but I got killed. And so I was quite frustrated, but suddenly I got this message from someone. She told me, "Oh, do you want to defeat that spider?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I went there, and she had seen my corpse there, so that's how she knew about my name. She was like a gnome lady, a female gnome, and we also took on the spider. She was a spellcaster, so we had a lot of DPS or damage dealing. As a berserker and a spellcaster, the spider went down quite quickly. And just today, I was thinking it would be so cool to team up with some characters that had pets, like a necromancer and any other thing, a beastmaster or whatever, so that I could fight alongside those as a berserker, those pets, and they could manage aggro, perhaps like kind of like ping ponging or kiting the enemy from one side to the other, provoking it, managing aggro, while I kept on chopping away with my axe. And I found a necromancer and sort of like a summoner character. I don't know if it's called the magician, but that character also has a pet, and they were brothers. They have been playing together in many different MMORPGs and role-playing games in general, and we teamed up and we managed to clear two very difficult quests that they are so deadly, those two quests, that on your way there you see so many corpses of players along the way, so many corpses, and that really builds up the tension. It's a very difficult it's a difficult journey. Not everyone manages to reach that a high level of experience. Some get really frustrated with the menus. In fact, when I first started to play EverQuest, like I said, it's my first time playing. I saw the menus, so many windows on the screen, and I was like, I'm gonna get a headache. I'm going to get a headache. And so I just kept on playing, and now I have mastered a small percentage of the different windows and commands, and I still have so many more things to learn, but there is an enjoyment in that. And I am not pressured to play at a certain pace. I can take my time. I can play perhaps half an hour or 1 hour a day, and I still feel like that sense of accomplishment, because I know that there are so many players that are dying. Some of them are quitting, like I mentioned, that a person in the comments that was like, "Oh, I got killed immediately, and I lost experience points, and I lost my gear. This game is horrible." But when you are careful, when you treat each encounter with a lot of seriousness, which is quite different to so many modern MMORPGs in current times, that they just, it almost feels it's a constant grind of raiding the same place over and over again, fighting the same enemy over and over again, going to those short dungeons that are very difficult and deadly, but over and over again. And as I enjoy this progression, this advancement in EverQuest, exploring all of those areas that I knew nothing about, I highly encourage that if you haven't played EverQuest, that you try it out. It's free to play. It's only if you reach level 60, if I remember correctly, when you need to consider if you want to purchase the monthly subscription. But nowadays, I'm just having such a blast playing and always finding a group. I think many of the players that are playing EverQuest are in the same boat. They are looking for that magic or grouping together to move through the storyline and take on all of those different enemies, and not looking constantly at the guides. If you get stuck, of course you're going to look for different clues and advice. But all of the players that I played with recently, the bard, the gnome caster, and these two, the necromancer and another magician, it's the first time we have experienced EverQuest. It feels like an incredible journey. So those were my thoughts on these somewhat disconnected subjects. I hope you found this somewhat of a casual talk video to be at least a bit entertaining. But I really want to know about your experience, your comments. What is your experience, your thoughts, your ideas related to the concepts that I talked about in this video? What do you think about the current state of tabletop role-playing games, MMORPGs, old school RPGs, the older ones that have existed from a long time ago, and the newer ones that try to emulate that sort of play style? I really want to know. Please share your thoughts in the comment section. And thank you so much for watching this video. My next tabletop RPG review is coming out pretty soon, part 1, because it's going to be a 3-part review. It's a very, I wouldn't say complex role-playing game, but there is a lot of richness to the theme, to the story. So I'm going to be handling it as a 3-part review. I hope you will watch part 1. And like I said, if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending right through RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you. Please check out the links in the description below, and see you later.